The following case study presentation will explore how cultural violence stemmed from political ideologies and practices played a key role in the development of genocide among disabled populations in Germany post-World War I and during World War II, and how ableist practices used during this historic atrocity are still employed in contemporary society. To do so, we'll begin by exploring how themes of control and perceived threat emerge as a derivative of warfare, and how these causal factors drove the development of ableist and culturally violent practices, such as euthanasia and sterilization. Moreover, we'll begin to provide a more in-depth analysis of these practices, and will conclude by providing an insight into current ableist medical practices that hinder the development of disabled populations and essentially violate the essence of the basic human rights. Genocide can be defined as an intentional attempt to annihilate a perceived threat or collectivity. According to Strauss, genocide is often a derivative of political influences and occurring as a result of events closely tied to governmental states acting as main instigators of violence. He further highlights how dynamics of struggle for power, containment, and control of perceived threat over distribution of national goods will facilitate genocide development. Literature highlights how little attention placed on significant events that occurred prior to the development of the Holocaust served as a catalyst for what will later give rise to one of history's largest atrocities. State-sanctioned killings rooted from powerful societal tensions and prominent scientific perceptions of difference were initially undertaken against individuals depicting a range of disabilities prior to World War II. The beginning of state-sanctioned practices, such as sterilization, began with the outbreak of World War I, triggering monumental changes for disabled populations in Germany. The effects of war resulted in a crumbling economy, creating a shift in the need for resources, thus causing deprivations of basic needs across caregiving facilities and asylums. Statistically, by 1918, more than 140,000 people had died in psychiatric asylums across Germany. Within a political science lens, perpetrators of violence in power would often define the victim group by imposing characteristics that justify the need for execution, making these aspects relevant to their ideological framework. Within this case study, it can be argued that the contextual factors, such as warfare and decaying economy, began to create a divide among German people. Thus, by the end of World War I, disabled people were merely seen as a burden to society, as they required extensive care and resources, but they were not able to contribute to a growing economy. Thus, as highlighted within Strauss, war is a significant factor in the origins and development of genocide, and this connection is recurrent within political science literature on genocide. Furthermore, as perceptions of inherent worth began to escalate among German population, increased attitudinal changes were created within medical and psychiatric communities. This involved various models of cheaper patient care treatment that allowed for the control of resources and social reforms. Ultimately, a range of political processes such as warfare and economic decay allowed for the Nazis regime to consolidate genocidal and ableist practices targeting disabled populations through the use of cultural violence. Cultural violence refers to the aspects of a culture that allow for legitimization of direct and structural violence. By 1929, psychiatric patients and the disabled population had doubled in comparison to the years following World War I, and the Great Depression exacerbated public and state officials' perception of inherent worth. Hence, individuals who were unable to aid the collapsing economy of Germany were no longer considered worthy of living, allowing for culturally violent practices to arise. The perception of burdensome individuals limiting the ability for economic growth fueled institutional debate for implementation of ableist practices such as sterilization and euthanasia. Culturally violent perspectives, or rather cultural violence itself, creates legitimization of the use of violence because of negative aspects attributed to a specific group. In the case of disabled people in Germany, the inability to contribute to a growing economy, the highly costing care, and the disability itself became justifying reasons for annihilation through both structural and direct violence. As politicians across the globe began to reportedly promote the use of eugenics to shape societies, German eugenicists grew in a much more radical, homogeneous approach that essentially supported the Nazi Germany ideology of an Aryan supremacy. As the Nazi regime came to power in 1933, a range of culturally violent endorsing factors began circulating German society, including false prevention of disability through state-sanctioned practices. These included the legalization of sterilization, also known as the law for prevention of genetically diseased offspring, which established compulsory sterilization of individuals characterized by a range of disabilities, and the implementation of a disability propagandized as life unworthy of living. Both of these state-sanctioned practices depicting structural violence were ultimately the result of a Nazi ideology of the 1,000-year reach, which essentially created genocidal markers for the elimination of those deemed unworthy of living due to physical and mental inferiorities.
The realm of disability and the Holocaust. Adolf Hitler in 1923 stated that it is a half measure to let incurably sick people steadily contaminate the remaining healthy ones. This is in keeping with the humanitarianism which, to avoid hurting one individual, lets 100 others perish. Individuals who were born with a disability and were victims of the Holocaust genocide can also be seen as the forgotten victims of the Holocaust. Hitler labeled those individuals who were disabled to be useless and wanted to eradicate this type of individual in any way he could. These individuals who lived throughout the Nazi reign were incredibly segregated and removed from society. The killing of individuals who were born with a disability and were victims of the Holocaust genocide can also be seen as the forgotten victims of the Holocaust. Hitler labeled those individuals who were disabled to be useless and wanted to eradicate this type of individual in any way he could. These individuals who lived throughout the Nazi reign were incredibly segregated and removed from society. The killing of At the conclusion of World War II, individuals who were born with a disability and who were killed as a result of the Holocaust were not recognized as people by government authorities or any legal institutions. The act and performance of sterilization of disabled individuals through the Nazi regime were consistently challenged by the German courts. The courts put forward the stance that the act of sterilization of such individuals with a disability under German law was considered to be an act that was legally acceptable, therefore being performed under acceptable circumstances. This regime had also initiated violent attacks to begin with. This was used as a way of intimidating their enemies. Although violent attacks had also started to occur in the public space and had disrupted the violence. Public violence had also tarnished the reputation and image of Germany on a world scale. In particular, disabled children were personally victimized as a result of Hitler's mindset to use the process of eugenics. One of the eugenic ideals Germany had used was to exclude those individuals who were seen as invaluable. Alongside this, doctors and midwives who practice in Germany were authorized to report any children who were displaying any sign of neurological deterioration, such as signs of autism, children who had appeared to be deaf from birth, and other neurological-driven disorders. The reporting was made up by the doctors and midwives and was then delivered to the Reich Committee, located in the city of Berlin, where the reports were analyzed by a set of 3 medically authorized experts. The children's portfolios were marked with. At the conclusion of World War II, individuals who were born with a disability and who were killed as a result of the Holocaust were not recognized as people by government authorities or any legal institutions. The act and performance of sterilization of disabled individuals through the Nazi regime were consistently challenged by the German courts. The courts put forward the stance that the act of sterilization of such individuals with a disability under German law was considered to be an act that was legally acceptable, therefore being performed under acceptable circumstances. This regime had also initiated violent attacks to begin with. This was used as a way of intimidating their enemies. Although violent attacks had also started to occur in the public space and had disrupted the violence. Public violence had also tarnished the reputation and image of Germany on a world scale. In particular, disabled children were personally victimized as a result of Hitler's mindset to use the process of eugenics. One of the eugenic ideals Germany had used was to exclude those individuals who were seen as invaluable. Alongside this, doctors and midwives who practice in Germany were authorized to report any children who were displaying any sign of neurological deterioration, such as signs of autism, children who had appeared to be deaf from birth, and other neurological-driven disorders. The reporting was made up by the doctors and midwives and was then delivered to the Reich Committee, located in the city of Berlin, where the reports were analyzed by a set of 3 medically authorized experts. The children's portfolios were marked with. The process of exterminating disabled individuals was a process that was ignored on a wide-scale basis. Prosecution of forced sterilization could not be heard throughout the trials in Nuremberg. This was due to the fact that legislation had already been in existence within the United States. The regime, which had been created by the Nazis and overlooked by Hitler, required careful, collaborative work with civil services and individuals who made up different professions. These included doctors, nurses. The process of exterminating disabled individuals was a process that was ignored on a wide-scale basis. Prosecution of forced sterilization could not be heard throughout the trials in Nuremberg. This was due to the fact that legislation had already been in existence within the United States. The regime, which had been created by the Nazis and overlooked by Hitler, required careful, collaborative work with civil services and individuals who made up different professions. These included doctors, nurses.
Since the mass genocide that occurred throughout World War II, a multitude of international laws and conventions aimed at preventing the targeted genocide and treatment of any societal group have been introduced, namely the United Nations Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Due to such, there is no direct contemporary correlation to the Nazi regime's genocide and sterilization of disabled persons. Notwithstanding, the discriminatory attitude towards disabled peoples is still very much prevalent today. Whilst the case studies outlined do not represent a mass genocide or mass sterilization of disabled persons, they undoubtedly represent deeply ingrained stereotypical attitudes towards disabled people. Further, sterilization still occurs commonly in armed conflict zones, although mainly to women and children. Prejudice against disabled individuals and ableism practices still occur in the contemporary world, despite the many legal and societal preventative measures implemented. Although ableism has decreased and social care for disabled individuals has improved significantly in comparison to the Nazi regime, families with disabled children or members still face a range of stigmatization and inequalities that other families do not experience. The social construction of disability impairs the quality of family life. Whilst they experience real financial and work inequalities, they also experience prejudice and ableism by society. Between 1985 and 1988, the Office of Population Censuses and Surveys, located across the United Kingdom, provided the most reliable results. The surveys recorded the prevalent inequalities for families with a disabled child, including 3/4 of the families not having sufficient financial means to care for the child, mothers of disabled children significantly less likely to be in the workforce, and Black single parents were the least likely to receive respite care services, notwithstanding often having the greatest needs. These account for the real inequalities families with a disabled child face. Although there are social inequalities as well, it has been found through qualitative research that social organisations perceive the whole family unit as disabled, rather than only one disabled family member. This is increasingly common when the disabled family member is a child. This perspective, placed on families with disabled members, detaches them from society and fuels ableism. Whilst there are no longer mass sterilisations of disabled people occurring in the contemporary world, there are still cases where disabled individuals are sterilised. As disabled individuals are unable to provide consent, as many would not understand the extent or repercussions of the procedure, legal courts decide on their behalf. A non-therapeutic sterilisation case in England of a 37-year-old male was approved by the courts. The man, who had an intellectual disability, more specifically Down syndrome, was approved to receive a vasectomy. The man, having an IQ of 40, equaling the mental capacity of a 6 to 9-year-old, was described as having borderline between significant and severe impairment of intelligence. This man was primarily cared for by his parents, although attended daycare during the day, where he met his girlfriend, also intellectually disabled, who he had a child with after their 10-year relationship. Out of concern of a similar circumstance repeating itself, the man's parents applied to the courts for a non-therapeutic sterilisation. The courts concluded that, as he lacked the capacity to consent to the procedure, the matter came before the court in the form of a declaration that he did not have the capacity to consent and that it would be lawful, in his best interests, to undergo the procedure. There have been many similar cases of this nature, most declining in non-therapeutic sterilisation processes. Performing sterilisation procedures without consent can result in the medical professional facing civil or criminal liability charges for battery. Involuntary sterilisations are processes performed on people with intellectual disabilities without their consent. The test of incapacity is set out under the Mental Capacity Act 2005. Short comments on the sexuality of people with intellectual disability as a socially constructed phenomenon, and how, although as a society we accept their rights to form sexual relationships, this acceptance comes at a price. The danger here is that in granting people with intellectual disability a measure of conditional freedom, it reinforces the idea that they can enjoy sexual freedom but at a cost. Whilst there may not be contemporary cases of mass sterilisation on disabled individuals, sterilisation still occurs, commonly in armed conflict zones. Altered fertility behaviour has been observed in many situations where armed conflict is present, both involuntary and forced practices. Colombia has experienced increased rates of sterilisation in correlation with the ongoing armed conflict occurring. However, not all of it was found to be voluntary. Colombia has had a long history of armed conflict and violence, beginning in 1960, and still occurring today by guerrilla group FARC, translated into English as Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. More than 3,600,000 Colombians were displaced against their will during 1985 to 2005, half being minors under 18. Further, between 1975 and 2004, there were over 554,000 homicides and murders committed. Majority of this armed conflict is a result of economic constraint, a similar issue that occurred during the period of the Nazi regime led by Hitler. Sterilisation was introduced to Colombia in 1972 and further sponsored by the government, making the medical process free for those women and men who decide to undergo sterilisation. Sterilisation programs occurring in Colombia were known to target women living in low socioeconomic circumstances. A study completed using a mixed methods approach revealed that while acts of armed conflict increased, women's autonomy regarding fertility decisions concerning sterilisation processes decreased. Further, Female soldiers in the FARC ranks have reported forced sterilization as a measure of reproductive control in exchange for participating in the guerrilla group. This result was concluded through the quantitative methods, where national census surveys were used as methodology. The qualitative methods used semi-structured interviews with 15 representatives from civil society, government, and international department organizations specializing in women's rights, sexual and reproductive health in Colombia. The results revealed that participants believe the Colombian healthcare system to be in a state of crisis, revealing that a lack of access to reliable healthcare may be a motivation for women to undergo sterilization. Participants further revealed that the many areas of Colombia experiencing armed conflict involves the armed perpetrators impeding on women's reproductive and sexual autonomy. This is included as part of the control over the population's everyday lifestyle, resulting in women having limited access to contraception and abortion, healthcare workers being forced to perform procedures, and mainly forced contraception and sterilization. This is only part of the way women and children are taken advantage of in Colombia. An interviewee, in response to a question on forced sterilization, commented, "As opposed to forced sterilization, when you think about women with disabilities, for instance, that is clearly forced, like against your will. If it's a woman who is just poor and she doesn't want any more children, but she doesn't see any more options or it is too expensive to buy another type of contraception, I would say that is not so clear," indicating that majority of sterilization occurs due to persuasion, women not having any other options, or it is forced. It is evident from the results obtained throughout the study that these acts of sterilization, whether voluntary or forced, occur in correlation with episodes of armed conflict and violence.
To conclude, within this presentation, we employed a political science lens to analyze how state-related practices contributed to the advancement of genocide and cultural violence against marginalized minorities, more specifically disabled individuals, during World War II. Furthermore, it provided a connection between the influence of political leaders, ideologies, and the manipulation of aspects of a particular population, permitting for the justification of violations of human rights. Hitler wanted to riddle out the groups of children with disabilities in order to make Germany a state of German people. In particular, disabled children were personally victimized as a result of Hitler's mindset that used the process of eugenics. In relation to a contemporary context, there has not been a mass genocide of disabled people to the degree of what occurred during the Nazi reign in World War II, although there are still ableist practices occurring that stem from the prejudice placed not only around the disabled individual, but also their whole family. These types of prejudicial attitudes are reflected through the continued sterilization of disabled individuals, accepted and allowed by courts. Although the ableist practices and sterilization occurring in contemporary contexts may not be as extreme as those occurring in World War II, there are ongoing and prevalent issues in society. Further, they reflect the World War II practices and the mindset on a much smaller scale and less aggressive form.